the video lecture on Chapter 2 of Poemen's text. This week's topic is relativism. We're going to go over some important points today, and then on Wednesday and Thursday I'll, just as usual, set up a lab so that you can come back on and ask me questions. We will go over during those lab sessions the chapter point by point. So when you sign up for or sign in to one of those lab meetings, if you would have your text up in front of you, we'll just go over it basically paragraph by paragraph. Next week, we will do the same with Chapter 3. We'll treat it in a similar fashion. And then after that, we will have a quiz on the introductory lectures on philosophy and on the first 3 chapters. As usual, this lecture will be on the YouTube channel, and one of the lab sessions will also be recorded and placed on the YouTube channel in case you've not been able to attend that meeting or you wish to go back and research and refresh your knowledge of what we've said. So with that out of the way, let's talk about relativism. Before I do that, though, let me go back and talk about chapter 1 rather, for just a moment. If you will recall, right before the section on morality as compared with other normative subjects, there's a little paragraph that begins with, "The study of ethics is not only instrumental but valuable in its own right." And having value in and by itself is what we call intrinsic value. So Poemen is saying that not only is ethics applied and informative, not only does it ask the question of what ought I to do in a particular circumstance, but it is good in and of itself. And it's that subject that I want to delve into for just a moment. So I said concerning what Professor Poemen observes at the end of the section of ethics and its subdivisions, that's almost the first few pages of chapter 1 if you had pages concerning intrinsic value. I've taken over 2 statements, one by Plato and the other St. Augustine. The first quote here is from Plato's dialogue, The Laws. It's a late dialogue when Plato was a very old man, in which he discusses the importance of asking the questions about what is right and good as opposed to just living an unexamined life. So let's just read over this section here from the Laws. This is from 803a. Now, all of Plato's dialogues and works by Aristotle as well have been divided into paragraphs and sentences. So this is paragraph 803 in the Laws. A means that it's the first sentence of that paragraph. Such then is our regulation of the matter. We have next to discuss the questions of the teaching and imparting of these subjects, how, by whom, and when each of them should be practiced. Then he begins to describe questions of the good and questions of the right, using a metaphor of the shipwright, one who designs and makes ships. So just as a shipwright at the commencement of his building outlines the shape of his vessel by laying down her keel, so I appear to myself to be doing just the same, trying to frame, that is, the shapes of our lives according to the modes of their souls, and thus literally laying down their keels by rightly considering by what means and by what modes of living we shall best navigate our bark of life through this voyage of existence. What is going to give you ultimate satisfaction is the most important question that you can ask yourself. And that is the question and the questions that philosophy goes for. That's what Plato is going for. In this case, in the words of the character, the Athenian stranger. He continues, and notwithstanding that human affairs are unworthy of earnest effort, necessity counsels us to be in earnest, and that is our misfortune. Yet since we are where we are, it is no doubt becoming that we should show this earnestness in a suitable direction. In other words, we may not be able to lead the perfect life, but we should attempt, by study and hard work, to lead the best life that we can. When we start discussing Protagoras, which is the first of the sophists, we'll delve into this just a little deeper, because Plato's got a dialogue named Protagoras in which he takes this head on. But no doubt I may be faced, and rightly faced, with the question, what do I mean by this? And Clinias, the interlocutor, the responder to the Athenian stranger, says, of course. What I assert is this, that a man ought to be in serious earnest about serious things and not about trifles, and that the object really worthy of all serious and blessed effort is God, while man is contrived, as we have said above, to be a plaything of God. And the best part of him is really just that. In other words, go with the flow. And thus I say that every man and woman ought to pass through life in accordance with this character, playing at the noblest of pastimes, being otherwise minded than they are now. In other words, you can't look to common answers for extraordinary solutions. It's a difficult task, and we'll talk about that again later. The next quote in this regard comes from St. Augustine, Book 5, Section 17 of Civitas Dei. You can find these works online, by the way, if you would like to read them and delve into them a little bit deeper. St. Augustine's book is very readable. It's sometimes translated as the city of God, although the Latin Civitas Dei does not exactly lend itself to that easy an English translation. St. Augustine says, far as the life of mortals is concerned, which is spent and ended in a few days, what does it matter under whose government a dying man lives, if they who govern do not force him to impiety and iniquity? Impiety, of course, is lack of belief, lack of respect for God or reality. So the most important thing one can do, according to both Plato and Augustine here, is to seek what is good. That is the person's major purpose in this world. Not just to get along, make good money, but to lead a life of contentment and search for meaning. Because life is short, and we need to be concerned with the most important matters, because life is passing away. It's significant here that Augustine says, as far as the life of mortals is concerned, which is spent and ended in a few days, what does it matter what kind of government or situation you're in? You need to devote yourself to study and learning and becoming a better person. Okay, that's to flesh out what Professor Poemen means by intrinsic value. And it's that end to which philosophy aims. All right, now we're going to move over to the question of relativism, ethical relativism. And as we said earlier, if you will recall the study that we did on the pre-Socratics, you remember Protagoras from that discussion. First of all, when you read Poemen's first few pages, he's working under the assumption that what he says back at the very first paragraph of the book, the subdivisions of ethics, he's assuming that we have accepted his three subdivisions of ethics as descriptive morality, moral philosophy, and applied ethics. We said back during that first or second lecture I guess it was, that we're not going to talk about descriptive morality because that is not the place of philosophy. So we said we were going to talk about three things. We said that there were three subdivisions of ethics. We call them moral theory, which agrees with one of the subdivisions of Poemen. But then we added a category that Poemen doesn't add. We said metaethics. That's asking questions about ethical statements. So it's not just enough for us to make an ethical statement. We want to test and try even what we consider to be the truth. That is what philosophy does. Philosophy analyzes and looks for the loopholes in what it assumes so that it can always get down deeper into a solution. So we said moral theory, metaethics, and then we agree with Poemen in terms of applied ethics as well, like philosophy of law, philosophy of science, medical ethics is one of those areas that is important, where we apply the principles that we've come up with to common occurrences within a discipline like medicine or law. So we call that applied ethics. So keep in mind that philosophy does not evaluate behaviors. As a philosopher, we're not concerned with people's feelings, with what people's opinions about things. Our focus is to delve into those opinions, to dissect them, to see if they ring true. So remember, the three things that ethics does, that real hard-hitting ethics does. Moral theory, meta-ethics, and applied ethics. After we've done the theory, after we've questioned the questions, we make proper applications. That's what we do. We don't concern ourselves with behavioral singularities or differences in the way cultures approach things. We're not interested in the differences between opinions of morality from one country to another. We're not interested in how people in Germany or France may differ on an ethical solution. We want to test everything. We want the truth, not private opinion, not public opinion. So that leads us to the two domains of relativism. The first is subjective ethical relativism. In subjective ethical relativism, it is individual preferences that determine right or wrong. Now, we do this quite often. You ought not to judge him. You don't know the situation that he's come out of. Well, we're not really there to judge anyone, but we do need to ask questions of what acts are right, and that's not dependent upon circumstance as much as it is dependent upon truth. And then raising this to another level, we have what's called conventional ethical relativism. It's the idea that cultures determine right or wrong. You see this most clearly in National Socialism in Germany and Italy before World War II, where the whole world is subservient to the decisions of one country. So what Germany wants is good for the world, and so the world must toe the line and obey Germany because they have decided what is right or wrong. So it goes from individual preferences to cultural preferences. And when one allows such individual or cultural preferences, then a hegemony, a ruling over our decisions and our discourse takes over. And we are wrong even if we are right. Now we'll go over the textbook chapter 2 in the labs on Wednesday and Thursday. So I'm not going to go into any great depth on chapter 2 right now, except just to introduce the concepts that we're going to be talking about. I want to, for our purposes, at this point, to cover the origins of relativism. Poyman doesn't do that, but I think it's important that we understand the historical context in which both individual and cultural relativism arose as an answer to the question of what acts are right. I've told you that relativism is probably the oldest and at the same time the most discredited of ethical theories. And we ran across this when we talked about Protagoras. Remember the statement of Protagoras, very simply, it's more complex than that, but man is the measure of all things, of things that are what they are, and of things that are not what they are not. So we decide what's right were wrong. The majority rules, and not only other human beings, but the rest of nature must go along with it. Now, Plato's main objection to relativism, other than that it engenders mob rule, is his philosophical critique of it. Now, this is one form of that critique, Plato's critique. If I say there is no truth, that is a universal claim. I'm making a logical claim that there is no truth. But then if I assert that it is true that there is no truth, then I myself am making a universal claim. Hence, the very nature of the assertion is self-contradictory. It contradicts itself. So it is a logical impossibility. If we hold to ethical relativism, Plato says we have made what's called a category mistake in logic. We've simply failed to be rational. Now, there's a more elaborate argument in the dialogue that very aptly is named the Protagoras. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. We've talked about Protagoras as the pre-Socratic. There's good evidence, I think, historically, that the old man Protagoras was alive, at least when Socrates was a younger person. We recall that the most famous quote of Protagoras was, this is the way it's written out here in Plato's Theaetetus, because when the pre-Socratics are concerned, we don't know that they didn't write anything, but we don't have anything that they wrote. The only thing that we have that is any significant historical context is the generation or two after them that recalled what they said and wrote it down. So this comes from Plato's Theaetetus. Here we go, Theaetetus, section 146, where he's describing in the Theaetetus Protagoras' assertion that man is the measure of all things, of things that are what they are, and of things that are not what they are not. And I've said here in these notes that we have no books or even passages that Protagoras wrote, only what was contributed or attributed by others. By the way, in this section 146 of the Theaetetus, Plato uses the word anthropos, which is not an individual man, but a species, so humankind, I guess we might say. Humankind is the measure of all things, the things that are what they are, and the things that are not what they are not. All right. So we've got Plato's argument here that relativism is logically deficient. Now he's also, remember, logic now is one species of philosophy, right? We've got metaphysics, ontology, logic, ethics, axiology. But Plato's in the Protagoras, in this dialogue, is going to introduce a real issue around this, not just a logical issue, but he's going to say that not only is it logically deficient, but it is also epistemologically, remember our discussion about episteme, epistemology, and ontos, ontology, but it's logically inconsistent. It is ontologically and epistemologically unsatisfactory as well. So logical inconsistency, basically philosophical inconsistency. And he does this at section 303, 313C. I'm going to write this out, I think. So at 313 in the Protagoras, Plato talks, he introduces Hippocrates. Everybody remember Hippocrates, from whence we get the Hippocratic Oath? I think I mentioned this in the lecture on the Pre-Socratics. Hippocrates is a Pre-Socratic as well. So at 313, he suggests that the Pre-Socratics, the Protagoras Pre-Socratics, are peddlers of opinion. And he introduces Hippocrates here because he's going to make the argument that if you go to the doctor and get an opinion, you're not interested in that so much, are you? I mean, you don't. When you go to the doctor, you don't. He says, "Well, I think this is what's wrong with you, so let's try this, that, or the other." No, the doctor runs some tests, and he or she does the best thing possible to find out what exactly is wrong with you. So when you go to the doctor, you don't want an opinion. You want to have research done and to come to an effective treatment. You're seeking effective knowledge. So he asks, why should, in matters of the soul, we seek anything less? So if you go to one of these pre-Socratic, Protagoristic sophist, and he simply begins to tell you matters of public opinion about what might be the solution to your problem, that's not very helpful. That's the reason that he brings Hippocrates into the equation, so that we begin to understand that we need experts, and the sophists are not experts. They simply try to maneuver people into accepting it. They try to talk you. They're snake oil salesmen, I guess you might say. They try to talk your problems into their solution. They make your problems fit their solutions rather than looking for a solution to your problem. So we're seeking effective knowledge, and we don't go to public opinion to find effective knowledge. Why should it be any different in questions of the soul? Plato says. Why should we be any less? Why should we be any more interested in opinion when it comes to the soul than opinion when it comes to our bodily ailments? Now, he comes to this next section at 330C, where he says that justice is self-predicating. Now, remember, we talked about intrinsic value. Remember at the first of this lecture, or that section on intrinsic value and instrumental value in the first chapter. So at 330C, Plato asks, what makes up an effective answer to soul questions? And he's got what he calls the face analogy that begins at 330C. Now let me see if I can draw a face here. So we got eyes and the nose and mouth and ears. And together, those make up a face. They make that's exactly what we mean by a face. Now, if one of those is deficient, gone, if we got an ear missing, then we still recognize it as a face. But eyes and nose and mouth and ears are what makes up a face. Now he says, consider we've got a lump of gold. Now consider, that's red, I know, but consider that this is a lump of gold. Now, where are the characteristics of that lump of gold? How do we recognize this as a lump of gold? Well, Plato says you have to go more deeply and you have to chip off pieces of it. So we don't recognize lumps of gold like we do faces. The constituent parts of gold are more difficult to identify than faces. Now then he says, let's take a look at what he says makes for the good soul. How do we recognize a good soul? Well, he says it's like the face. We recognize the soul because it's made up of temperance, that's a T there, by the way. It's made up of temperance, it's made up of justice, it's made up of prudence, and it's courageous. So, we recognize, Plato says, we recognize the good soul because we recognize it as a face. Now, as in faces, he would argue that sometimes this is deficient, but yet we can see it. It might be corrupted in some way. It might not be perfected, but it's still there. And it is the job of the philosopher, the doctor of souls, to perfect, just as a plastic surgeon would go in and correct deficiencies in ears and noses. The philosopher can go in and correct deficiencies of justice, prudence, temperance, and courage. Now remember, I've said you got to know these are the we'll talk about this later when we go into depth in Plato. These are the things that make the essential human being. Every human being has justice, prudence, moderation, or courage in their makeup. They are sometimes deficient. They need a teacher like Socrates to question and hone, perfect, bring these out, and make them deeper and more consistent. All right. Now, he goes even deeper than this, and he argues that when it comes to these things that make up the good soul, that they are good. All of these things that we've talked about, temperance, justice, prudence, courage, are all good. Whoop. They make for good. They equal the good. And because they all equal the good, they are all related, just as a nose is not a nose unless it is contained on the face. It's certainly not an effective nose. And how do we know that all of these things are good? Well, that's because there's got to be something outside of opinion. All of this for Plato requires that there's something outside of opinion that justifies our knowledge and recollection of justice, prudence, moderation, and courage. Just because there's some general theory of human, we all know what it means to be a human, unless one is horribly injured or something. It's 2 eyes, 2 ears, mouth, nose. So there is an immediate kind of recollection of this, a kind of a honing in of this. When we see faces, we simply recognize this. So there has to be something. He calls this a form. If I can get this thing to work. There has to be a form of some type that acquaints us with individual aspects of this whole and allows us to see them as contained. So there's got to be something, Plato says, that is teachable, that we can come to know more deeply than just opinion, because opinion doesn't cut it when it comes to even questions of how we treat bodily ailments, much less philosophical, spiritual elements. So there's got to be something that relates individual aspects to the whole. Now, he's searching, even in the Protagoras, he's searching for what this is going to be. Sometimes he calls it the good. Sometimes he calls it beauty. But it's all the same thing. What we call it, according to Plato, is less important than the fact that it's got to be there. There's something that's required that acquaints us with, that's in our very being somehow. And he can't explain this so much right now, but there's got to be something that makes it what it is. And this is what philosophers ought to be looking for, and not going around asking people what their opinions are. Now, I know I don't know that if you can't do that anymore. Not many people watch the news anymore, but you can recall probably, and when you remember listening to local news, something would happen in Charlotte or one of the areas that surrounded you, some catastrophe would happen, and the reporter would be going around sticking a microphone in people's face and asking them what they thought about this, that, or the other. Well, that's ultimately what people think about that is ultimately unimportant. A philosopher, Plato said, wants to get underneath to the causes and effects of this and not just what people think about it. And it's not sufficient, Plato argues, for the philosopher to be going around like a reporter asking people what their opinions are. The task of philosophy is to get underneath, to get to the foundation, to get to the bedrock, to drill down, if you will, and get to the bottom of things. So, he's later on, about 350, he starts asking questions that try to get to the bottom of how do you perfect? How do you do this? How do you make sure that justice, prudence, moderation, and courage, the virtues, are beautiful? Well, you do that. He's going to bring in the bodily metaphor about this again, and he does this at 351d. He says that developing justice, prudence, moderation, developing virtue is like body exercise. And again, remember he talked about Hippocrates when he wanted to get to the very basis of how we get underneath and ask the important questions. We look for true scientific answers to questions of why my back hurts, not what other people are doing to cure their back problems. We want our doctor to take x-rays, to do lab work, to apply their vast training to the question of why my back hurts. And instead of looking to Protagoras and these peddlers of raw opinion, Plato argues we should be doing the same thing with questions of the soul. Virtues are like body exercises, we might say. If you want to be healthy, we know we need to exercise our body. Well, if we want to be intelligent, we need to exercise our mind. If we want to be good, we need to exercise these virtues. Because the soul can grow lazy and weak and flabby, just like a body can. And when the soul goes flabby and weak, then the answers, only then do the questions of trying to do what's pleasurable and avoid what's painful come into effect, because pleasure and pain are simply weak images. They occur simply because the soul rather, is not strong enough to confront reality, to confront the world. Because we don't get ultimate satisfaction when we are devolved into thinking in terms of what brings me pain or brings me pleasure, per se. Because we can be happy all day long and be miserable human beings. Or rather, we can go through all kinds of pleasure all day long and be miserable human beings. So the exercise of the soul, then, the philosophical soul, looks to supplant evil with good. So the question is good and evil and not pleasure, pain. Because the pleasure and pain layout comes at a much lower level. And we know that sometimes we need to endure pain for the good. And if it's just a question of pleasure and pain, then we're not going to make the sacrifices that ultimately lead to health and healing. Just as you have, if you have a difficult cancer, and your doctor tells you that you're going to have to endure chemotherapy, but if you endure chemotherapy, then there's a good chance that you might survive. But if the question is simply one of pleasure and pain, you're not going to undergo the chemo. If you make decisions under the lower level of pleasure and pain, according to Plato, you're going to end up being an unhappy person, an unsatisfied person. As a matter of fact, there's a great quote from Plato that says, "The unexamined life is not worth living," and that's what he's talking about. Because if you don't examine your life, both its physical and its spiritual elements, then you're going to end up as a very angry, hate-filled, pain-filled person. So sometimes you have to endure pain for the good. And ultimate happiness requires skill, which clearly, Plato says, comes through philosophical inquiry. He calls it the art of measurement. He calls it the science of the good. So looking for this form, the good, the beautiful, all of these things require skill, which only comes through philosophical inquiry, and the art of measurement, the science of the good. And at 358c, he makes, this is toward the end of the Protagoras, Plato says, "To act beneath yourself is the result of pure ignorance. To be your own master is wisdom." So as long as we seek public opinion, as long as we make decisions on opinion-based qualities, then we will never be wise, and we will always be less than what we can be. And the unfortunate realization of relativism, so says Plato, is the fact that it is pure ignorance and it is always acting beneath oneself. And it will never lead to wisdom. So, that's the philosophical problem of relativism that is probably the best answer to why relativism is a problem that's ever been devised. I hope that's helpful. And we will discuss this in our labs middle of the week. And again, if you have any questions about this that you would like to ask, you may do so by email and we'll set up a time to talk. So if you can't make it to one of the lab help sessions, then look at the recording, and if you need more help than that even, then feel free to email me and we'll set up a help session. I hope you had a good weekend, and I will talk to you later.